This is an iHeart podcast. Guaranteed human.
Body Bags with Joseph Scott Moore. A long, long time ago, when I was a little boy, there were certain cultural icons that captured my attention. Let's see. Who were some of them? Oh, I know. I liked Muhammad Ali because he was such a bombastic kind of personality. I liked because he was so rare. You know, back then he would get in front of the camera and he would say things and he could make things up, you know, quote, homemade poetry, if you will, on the fly. I loved Evel Knievel as a little boy. I had the little Evel Knievel toy, you know, that you'd wind up and you could jump boxes with it and all that sort of thing. And I loved ABC, Wide World of Sports, watching him jump over cars. And of course, subsequently, I think at Caesar's Palace broke every bone in his body when he jumped over that fountain. If you ever go to Vegas, check out the size of that fountain. I don't know how he did it. And then, of course, you know, Snake River Canyon. Don't forget about that. That wasn't exactly a brilliant move, but it's something that stands out in your mind. Another cultural icon in this former little boy's mind was probably Buford Pusser. And the reason it was so cool is that there was a movie that, of course, I was too young to go and see because of the level of violence, but you knew about him. You heard about him. You heard about Walking Tall. You heard that he carried this massive stick that he would walk in and he'd bust up bad guys. He'd run the ne'er-do-wells out of the county. Of course, larger than life. Joe Don Baker playing him on the screen. But you know what? Sometimes, just like in Hollywood, when you go behind those facades that are on the back lots, you realize that they're empty. And many times, they're filled with garbage and trash. You don't see it on the outside, but dig deep enough and you'll see it. Today, I'm going to discuss a possible domestic homicide that involves Buford Pusser. And we're going to explore this a little bit and probably put an end to those dreams that I had as a little boy that there were real heroes out there, at least those that Hollywood told me to believe. I'm Joseph Scott Morgan, and this is Body Bags. You know, Dave, one of the myriad of reasons, just one of the reasons that I dislike Hollywood nowadays, is that their brains seem to be so infantile that they're incapable of creating new content. I absolutely despise remakes. There are very few that are out there that are worth my time viewing. You know, I'll sit there and I'll see some movie that's being remade that was fantastic in its original form, and you're sitting there thinking, why are you going to redo this? And, you know, just a couple of years back, we had Dwayne "The Rock" Johnson that came in and remade Walking Tall,
Wait a minute.
the movie.
You know what's funny about that? What you just said cracks me up.
What's that?
You said just a few years ago.
Yeah.
21 years ago. That movie was made in 2004.
Holy smokes.
Yeah.
Hey, I got another question for you about that then.
Go ahead.
I wonder, in light of this recent evidence, I wonder if Dwayne "The Rock" Johnson is signing up to do a sequel.
Well, you know,
do you think? What do you think?
I will tell you, it's interesting because that Walking Tall that he did, it was not a remake. It was not a retelling it was just utilizing an image from back in the day, the big stick and Walking Tall, and everything else was, you know, it had nothing to do. It was all brought to a contemporary look at things. It had nothing to do with what the original story was, which, by the way, Buford Pusser, okay, the original Walking Tall movie, and you mentioned Joe Don Baker. I was like, I remember Bo Svensson.
Yeah.
Because they did a Walking Tall TV show in 1981.
It sure did.
And it didn't last long. And I always thought the reason it didn't really work is because it wasn't based in truth. I always thought there was something wrong about the story of Buford Pusser. And as I got older, I thought maybe I have a weird feeling about it because he was so young when he became the sheriff. He was the youngest sheriff in the United States of America in the early 60s when he first became sheriff there in McNair County, right?
Yeah.
And anyway,
just up the road in Tennessee from where we are. Yeah.
And I look at this and the things that I know now, and I look back, and most of the people that were made into heroes were not heroic in life. They were heroic in the stories that were told about them, but they were not heroes in their personal life. And I don't like seeing these so-called heroes torn down at all. But I like the truth to have its day. And I wonder, where was the truth when this happened? Because people knew then. You realize what we're about to talk about was common knowledge at the time the BS was flying. Yes. There were people that at least, or no, maybe, you know what? If it wasn't then, they're claiming it was.
That's why you got to take a lot of these things with a grain of salt. There's only, like, I have very few heroes that I actually believe in now. I think like one that stands out in mind is probably Audie Murphy, that I love because he never sought out the glory that landed upon him. And he was just one of these people that just took the bull by the horns, and he didn't care. And of course, he paid a price for it later on in life. You know, I mean, he had terrible problem with alcoholism and, you know, just all these things, you know, that he bore the burden of that people didn't understand, you know, shell shock and all that. Buford Pusser was not that person. He was no Audie Murphy. There's heroes. I take exception with people too. They throw that term around a lot. You hear it a lot. Oh, wow, you're so brave. You're a hero. No, you're not. No, you're not. There are real heroes out there, and it's really sad. I think that you know, that Buford Pusser occupies that space where they have so idolized him to the point where he for many years was viewed as a hero, and now with these stories that have come to light in the wake of new information that has come about as a result of his journey, if you will, his matrimonial journey, and things that they suspected that he was involved in. Now, you know, we view things in a different light relative to him. You know, we heard these tales of the Dixie Mafia, you know, for years and years, and how it was integrated into a lot of the underworld stuff. And of course, I think they try to pull that narrative in with these activities that were going on in this county where he was, you know, the sheriff of. And there's not really a lot of meat on the bone from an evidentiary standpoint that was the case, I think. And so, you know, it makes you question everything else. And here's really the thing is that, as we always say, the science in any case is not going to lie. And many people don't anticipate that there is going to be a telling of the truth down the line. But, you know, I got to tell you, if an individual happens to be, I don't know, let's say exhumed, the dead, in fact, do tell tales. Brother Dave, I'm curious about this. You know, I felt like that Pusser's story had been essentially, I don't know, put to bed for decades now. And, you know, and I know the people up there, you know, kind of scrap out a living. You know, they have a museum up there, I think, that kind of honors his memory. And, there's all manner of things that go on. And, that's kind of been a cottage industry, I guess. Now I kind of feel sorry for the people now, retrospectively.
Well, Joe, when the story first broke that they were filing a report on this, the website for the museum was down, and it was not open. They closed it for a few days, but I went to it before taping today. The Buford Pusser Home and Museum is open. The website is. And the first line right there in the middle, credited with Buford Pusser, like his slogan or the theme that he lived by. What's right is right and what's wrong is wrong. It doesn't matter who you are. I thought how fitting it is if they actually leave that on there and now tell the real story based on information. Yeah. I think that would be a way to honor his wife and maybe open up a real discussion about domestic violence. We just did a story the other day, domestic violence, where a young woman was allegedly thrown over the 24th balcony, by her husband, who has been convicted of domestic violence now. And yet, at first, I don't know what I still don't know how that's going to be ruled because there was so much damage, pulverized. Well, in this case, Joe, you have Buford Pusser's story. And I'm calling it that because even back when he first told it, there were people that didn't buy it. It didn't make a lot of sense. I mean, he claims that, one of the things they built the Walking Tall myth on was that he was the guy who stood up to, all these wrongdoers in the hills, and they were trying to kill him. They were trying to assassinate him. They were trying to, catch him and get him. And this happens, at 3 a.m? And he says his wife is going out on a call. Who takes it? What sheriff?
I don't know.
Would take their wife out on a call at 3 o'clock in the morning?
I don't know. I think the mythology of this thing is kind of painted out so that, she's also the hero wife or something like that. And again, mythologizing this to that point where, she becomes essentially a prop.
Right.
Think about that just for a second in this story. I think Hollywood, viewed it that way, certainly. How brave, this brave couple, that are going to sally forth into the darkness of night, and go out, and he's going to run this call, a potentially very violent call, where not only that, he also, if you're to believe this, and it's one thing if you have a sheriff, okay, and this does happen. I've actually seen this happen where there are crime scenes I've rolled out on, and you've got a high-ranking official that happened to be out at night with his wife, okay? And they show up at a scene because that high-ranking official has been notified that something major has happened. Like if you got a multiple homicide that's been committed, this individual wants to go out there because they're the face of the elected sheriff or is the sheriff, and their spouse would actually wait in the car. And I've actually seen that because I've known their spouses. We go to parties and all that stuff, and I might acknowledge by waving at them, I would think I wouldn't want this to be my spouse. But we're not talking about, you're going out to the local fish house on Friday night and you happen to get a call and you're talking about somebody that's like, yeah, I got this call, and she's going to hop in the car to go to this potentially very dangerous event with him and show up. It seems, first off, if you're truly a law enforcement officer, and there is no excuse for time, you can't say, well, it was a different time back then. No. Things were dangerous. They were dangerous. There was violence. And he, and prior to this, he had allegedly experienced violence. He was aware of the violence that was going on. So you're telling me that the most precious person in your life, who, by the way, should be your spouse first, and then your kids, you're going to put them in the car with you and go out to this location. And, oh, by the way, there's a hit team out that's going to take you out. This sounds like something that's created in, I don't know, in somebody that's living on a fantastic plane in their brain, and Hollywood bought into it. And listen, they put a lot of butts in seats, didn't they, in the theaters with this thing. This thing was this. People don't realize what I'm not going to say it was a cultural landmark, but the theaters were full to see this movie, and the book also sold.
Well, Jay, you think about it though. It was Hollywood didn't create the story, or they sold it, but the story had been going on for 6 years before that 1973 movie came out. This happened in 1967.
Yeah.
So in 1967, he says that he's got this domestic violence call he has to go on in the middle at 3:30 in the morning, and his wife volunteers to go with him. He claims that a car pulled up alongside his, and again, 3:30 in the morning on a domestic violence call, and somebody pulled up alongside his car and fired several shots, killing Pauline and injuring him in what he claimed was an ambush intended for him and was carried out by unknown assailants. They were never caught. The sheriff was shot. Buford Pusser was shot. Wasn't he shot in the face?
Yes, he was.
Yeah. So and his wife is dead. Now, usually when you have somebody with a self-inflicted gunshot wound, it's usually not in the face. Is it?
No, it's not. And that's quite interesting. But it was in such a location, I think, that well, first off, if you see any of the post-surgical images of him, dude's disfigured. Right. I mean, I got to hand it to him. Your boy's disfigured. You know, you can see that it almost, if this was, if his face was a candle, you'd say that it only burned on one side because it's like drooping. You know, it's kind of drooping and hanging down. He went through multiple reconstructive surgeries. But interestingly enough, they didn't score a shot to the top of his noggin. This thing is it's peripheral. So if you're going to, and look, if you're going to try to sell it, if you're going to act the part, you know, it'd be one thing, you know, you see these people in movies. It's always the people in movies, you know, the hero that gets shot in the shoulder or the thigh. Yeah. But yet they can put rounds on target at center mass at 1,000 yards with a handgun. You know? Yeah. You know, but I got to hand it to him. He really sold it. And so, you know, it's a survivable injury, and also further consideration of the case and his injuries, the assessment of it is that it was determined that this was not a distance injury, that this injury was in fact close range. And I guess one of the questions that I would have about this is going back to surgical notes that would have had to have been included in this particular case. What was the nature of the injury? Because this is not a case where back then there wasn't a lot of what we refer to, and people don't know that this practice exists, but it actually does. You know that there's actually a practice called living forensic pathology. No. Where you can have, and I've been involved in, well, I guess two or three cases where we had other fatalities, but the forensic pathologist actually went in and examined a living victim to do an assessment of the subject at the hospital. It's kind of fascinating stuff. You don't hear about it a lot, but it does happen. In this case, you got a guy that's going through multiple reconstructive surgery, and one of the things that we do, let's just say that he had died. All right. Did you know, Dave, that when we request medical records, let's just say that somebody survives, they get into surgery, the forensic pathologist will ask the investigators to compel the hospital through a subpoena to get all of the surgery notes. We're going to get all the surgery notes, and the surgeon will actually, in pretty detailed notes, will describe the track of the wound, because they're going to go in and they're actually going to retrieve, let's say, for instance, you've got an indwelling round that's still in the body. They're going to go in and retrieve that round if they can get to it. Sometimes they can't. Got a great story. I got to tell you sometime about that, but that's for another episode. But anyway, they will go in and they're going to track the wound kind of like we do in the morgue, but their goal in tracking the wound is to go in and first off stop any kind of hemorrhage that's in there. That's the first stage. If you're trying to do surgical repair, they want to go in and those little, you can have these kind of gross injuries that come up as a result of the wound track where it's kind of cavitating, through the body. But you can have these little micro injuries, where you've clipped little vessels that are, hemorrhaging into the soft tissue. They've got to go in and stem that bleeding. So they're tracking the wound kind of like we do, but it's with a much finer point. So we would, let's just say that under that circumstance, the person died in the hospital, we would subpoena those notes, those surgical notes, and we'd like to try to get them before the autopsy. We go in and review what the surgeon saw. And even though that surgeon saw it in place, we're still going to do the autopsy. This is a homicide that we're talking about. And we're going to note all of the surgical repairs, maybe where they failed to pick up on things, not as like a judgment, but just to explain the death, because there's a certain area, sometimes you can have these catastrophic injuries that as desperately as a surgeon might try to repair them and stem bleeding and all this other tissue damage where it's compromising organ system's ability to function and they're bleeding out and all that sort of stuff. There's not enough that they can do. But the person dies in a post-surgical state. We want to know all of that before we go in. But with Pusser, I'd like to know, what did the surgeon see? And did they make any kind of notes relative to any kind of powder deposition on the skin? Because if you're, retrospectively, there's this ER physician who is apparently also a de facto medical examiner up in Tennessee that was called in to consult on this thing. And he claims that he's gone in and reviewed the stuff, and he could tell that this was actually an injury that was sustained at a close range to Pusser. And that there's evidence that this round was potentially self-inflicted, Dave, as opposed to something, because what's the scenario again with this? They're saying that he claims that people pulled up alongside of them and began to fire into the vehicle that they're riding in. And it turns out that doesn't seem like that's, that dog's going to hunt.
Well, you got a little problem with blood spatter on the hood. That's a little problem. And there were other problems because the injury suffered by Pauline did not match his story. And the thing is, Joe, I keep going back to this, but they knew it at the time. You already have the problem with the evidence at the scene not matching his story, and they knew that then. They knew that in 1967. But what was the reason for digging up his wife? Because you've explained to me that is one big problem. It's not something that judges like to do. It is rest in peace, right?
Yeah. Yeah, and they take that very seriously. But here's the thing. What I think the impetus behind this is not the FBI, but the TBI, the Tennessee Bureau of Investigation, and an organization I've always been really impressed with over the years, and their thoroughness. Those folks don't get paid a lot of money, but they work with what they have, and they're really tenacious. The ones that I've come across, and there's great stories about some of the cases that TBI has worked on over the years, and they do have a cold case squad. Dave, this case. Now listen to me. This is kind of fascinating. This case is still a cold case. Just let that sink in. This is still a cold case. This is an unsolved violent assault case. Also, oh, by the way, we've got a woman that's a homicide victim, and we've got these assailants that have been, rolling down the road in a car, and this is a targeted attack on a public official. And it remained unsolved. I don't know. I think that we might not like to think of it this way, but if you've got an open case involving an elected official and it is unsolved, and it was something as horrible as a local sheriff who was ambushed while going down the road, and in his official capacity to work a domestic violence call, and his wife is murdered along the way. That's something that no matter how much time passes by, people are still going to have an interest in, particularly the Tennessee Bureau of Investigations. Every fall, Dave, I take my class at Jacksonville State University. I take my class. I teach a course in the fall called Clandestine Burials. Matter of fact, I'm in the middle of it right now. We're winding down the semester. I take them out to the cemetery. And because most people, first off, don't know the difference between a cemetery and a graveyard. They don't know the difference between a casket and a coffin. They don't know what a vault is. Many of them have never taken time to read headstones, which is something that, as morbid as it is, I find cemeteries very peaceful. Particularly if I don't have a loved one that's buried there, there's a certain solemnity that comes along with it. And I love, because you're reading, you're walking through stones of history. I try to be very respectful out there. But you've got these engravings on stones, that talk about the love that individuals had for their family members decades and many times those families are completely gone now, but they still occupy the space that you currently occupy. You know what I'm saying?
Wow.
And so I take my kids out there, and some of these graves in our local municipal cemetery are very, very old. Some of them are antebellum. They're pre-Civil War. Some of them are caving in, and you can kind of get an idea of old burial practices. You can see that at one point in time, somebody really cared for the grave. They may have put up a wrought iron fence, and now even the wrought iron fence is collapsing. It's covered in rust. The gate is off the hinges. There's overgrowth. But still, you see these that are pristine. Every now and then you'll see, I know that a couple of times we've seen elderly people that are out there. I remember at one date a couple of years ago, back in the fall, there was a little old lady that was at a grave, and she was knelt at the foot of the grave, and she was weeping, and she was off in the distance. And I told the kids, stay, we're not going that way. We're going here to the really old section of the graveyard. And the reason I make this point is that you mentioned RIP, rest in peace, right? You see that everywhere. You can see it on the internet, and social media. People will say, happy heavenly birthday, RIP, and you're thinking about it, you go out there, and these are families, that are represented here. There's individuals that have lived these lives, and some of them ended very violently. What's fascinating to me about Pauline Pusser is the fact that, in a way, her death and her burial is kind of a clandestine burial. In the sense that, and when I say clandestine, that means that you're trying to hide something. The reason I take my kids out of the graveyard, so I want them to be able to see what a regular grave looks like. But, it's fascinating that maybe, just maybe, people actually die. Someone does not do a sufficient investigation, and that person gets put in the ground. And in a way, that's kind of clandestine, isn't it? Wow. Because they're buried, and no one thinks when they're standing around a grave. I wonder if Pusser, all those years ago, as he went back to visit his wife's grave, and she was placed in the earth, if after he had gone through all the surgeries and everything, I don't know if he ever went back out there. I guess he did, to honor her, or at least demonstrate honor. If he ever thought, well, got away with it. No one's ever going to crack this grave open. No one's ever going to know. I'll take this with me to my grave. And, of course, he died, I think, in 74 as a result of a car accident. He had some kind of hopped up Corvette that he died in. And, of course, that secret was taken to the grave with him, Dave. But, when you think about back in the 60s when she was interned there, things were hidden, weren't they, Dave?
She had a healing broken nose when she was buried. A healing broken nose when she was buried.
Yeah.
So the person that was there when she's dead, they're examining it. They see, they know, and nobody says anything.
Nobody at all. And, going back to the earlier part of our conversation, Dave, the idea that he would take his wife on a domestic disturbance call. How many times have I mentioned, and you said it too, all right? And it's rote. I mean, it's everywhere. The most dangerous call a police officer will ever go on is not some drug cartel thing. It's not. It's it's
Who
not
the
some
bad
kind
guys
of
are
vehicle
then.
entrapment. It's a domestic violence call because they're so unpredictable. So with that knowledge in mind, you're going to take your wife there. Well, let me just kind of throw this into the flame as well here. If you're popping your wife in the face to the point, he was a big man too. I mean, he was big and powerful.
6'6".
Yeah. And had a history as an athlete, I believe.
He'd been a wrestler.
Kind of sounds like a brute to me.
Yep.
And Pauline, everything I've heard, she's kind of diminutive, quiet, beautiful. Well, if your husband is so inclined and he's been putting his hands on you and popping you in the face to the point where you fracture her nasal bone, I'm not talking about the cartilage here. I'm talking about a facial fracture. Here's the thing about facial fractures, Dave. I wonder who else was aware of this. Because with fractured noses, you know what you get? You get raccoon eyes. Because that goes to what's referred to as a basilar skull fracture. The floor of the skull in that area, that's why you see people that, you'll see people that have had like facial reconstruction or, some kind of plastic surgery on their nose, size reduction or whatever it is. They'll have bilateral black eyes called raccoon eyes. And that's because you get this trauma to the bone that's in there. And eyes many times will be swollen, black. And I'd like to know the domestic history on them. Was she the type of person that you wouldn't see for a period of time? Because abuse victims are like that sometimes. They get abused. Many times they're not allowed to leave the house by their abuser. They have to stay indoors, particularly if they're presenting with any kind of trauma, because generally the abuser is not that stupid. How are you going to explain, gee, honey, why are both your eyes black? I bumped into the door. Really? You bumped into the door? That's why both of your eyes are black? She can't say that, my husband with hands the size of a canned ham, landed a blow in the middle of my face and fractured my nose. Lots of times when abusers strike, and they'll do this with kids as well, they like to punch in the stomach. Do you know that? They like to punch in the stomach. Because you're going to be clothed in that area. And they'll do things where trauma can be hidden, but where the trauma cannot be hidden, they'll hide the victim from public view. So I guess, when you're going to do an exhumation, and you can actually tell this, her body would in fact have been x-rayed. And anything that was there, or the skeletal remains, all that remains of her. Remember, she was buried back in the 60s, Dave. I'd like to know how much remained of her that was casketed. And even, let's say, all of the soft tissue is gone. You'd be surprised with embalmed bodies, particularly dependent upon how well they're embalmed, how you can have surviving soft tissue sometimes that'll be there. It's kind of amazing. And it all depends. It depends on a lot of factors. If first off, the embalming job was really good. All right. That's the baseline. And if you can keep moisture out of the vault and certainly out of the casket, you want to if you can keep it reasonably dry, many times that will facilitate preservation. And plus the embalming fluids that they used back then were, still had a lot of heavy metals in them and that sort of thing. I don't know how well she would have been preserved, but they would have to have something to work with. But if she's got, and they've been able to appreciate this, Dave, apparently per this exhumation, that she's got a resolving facial fracture here, and that they were able to pick up on it, that it was and this is key, man, that there's a trauma response here, that you've got a nose that was in fact healing at the time she was murdered. So this is pre-existing trauma. And how far out did the rest of this trauma extend? Do you just have like one fracture line? Because even, and I've seen this, even in cases where we will have people that will sustain injuries and they have pre-existing, trauma, like to bone, the bone will respond, and sometimes it'll do what's called modeling. You'll have this kind of abnormal growth, and it's the bone trying to kind of reconstitute itself so that it's still viable. It's fascinating. And you can appreciate that. You can look at it, and I think that somebody that's probably more well-versed than I am can say, okay, that's not some type of disease pathology. That's evidence of trauma. And you'll see maybe an outgrowth from it. You see it in long bones a lot. They'll get these kind of gnarly looking, presentations on the shaft of the bone, particularly where people have not had their bones like professionally set. The bone, nature dictates that it wants to rejoin. And if they can approximate that, you'll get these kind of odd presentations. I wonder what they saw with her nose that gave them an indication that it was in the midst of healing. That's kind of fascinating. And how long did this happen before the so-called ambush occurred, Dave? Sorry, I didn't mean to step on.
No, I remember asking you about this when this came out a couple of months ago, that I wanted to know for my own edification, how could they know this? And I was looking at, they just have made parts of the report, which is very, very long. They've made it available through the University of Tennessee. And one of the things that I found fascinating about the report of that day is that I just want to share this with you, because this is kind of, to me, it's a hint. To me, it's according to the files, witnesses said that Buford Pusser attempted to flee from emergency personnel that were responding to provide medical care for Pusser and his wife. In a statement to the TBI, Donald G. Smith stated that on the morning of August 12, 1967, he was working on the ambulance that picked up Buford Pusser. Smith provided that he couldn't understand much of what Pusser was saying. You mentioned his injuries. According to Smith, Buford's injuries were severe, and it was difficult to distinguish what he was trying to say. Smith told the TBI, he described that Pusser on top of the hill on Highway 45 going south on Guys Road, and that Pusser was driving the car and Pauline Pusser was lying over his lap. He told investigators that Pusser refused to stop the vehicle for emergency personnel. Now, was he doing that to make sure her injuries were going to be fatal?
Making sure that she bled out, in other words?
Right.
Yeah, because, the thing about it is that even back then, law enforcement, they were still trained in first aid. They had, and if I'm not mistaken, Pusser had served time in the United States Marine Corps. He would have had some level of basic first aid. And it doesn't take a rocket scientist to understand that if you've got a traumatic related event, particularly relative to gunshot wounds, you got to stem the bleeding. You have to. So I can't imagine that that an individual that would have this kind of knowledge relative to just basic trauma assessment would not want someone to get help, not just for themselves, but for their so-called loved one as well. You would want this to happen so that you could observe them, having a shot, at least some kind of shot of survival, Dave.
I know. It breaks my heart. It just does.
Well, I got to tell you, just let me run this down to you. If just from a forensic pathology standpoint and from an anthropology standpoint, Pauline, when she died, this is the evidence that they found. So she had survived, or strike that, Dave. I'm sorry. 3, 2. Pauline had sustained an entrance gunshot wound, actually to her left occipital bone. So if everybody in the sound of my voice right now will take either your left or your right hand, and you will reach behind your head, and you will find that bump on the back of your head, that bony bump that's called the occipital protuberance. Okay, if you will find that point of reference, move over to the left side of that bump on the back of your head, and that's still your occipital bone. That's where the bullet, the projectile, actually entered, Dave. And this round, that's an entrance wound. And what do we classically define you remember we've had this several times, an execution style murder. You'll hear that term thrown around a lot. It's generally somebody, you have this vision of somebody like kneeling before you or seated next to you, and they sustain a gunshot wound to the back of the head. And this round, interestingly enough, travels from back to front. And the reality is that there is still to this day, there are projectile fragments after all these years that were actually found inside of her skull, Dave. Now, there's marked signs of decomposition, but here's the other thing. When they examined her body, they were able to, and I know that they did x-rays. They had to. That's, if you're going to go to the trouble to exhume a body, you're going to do like extensive x-raying of the body. They were able to pick up on the fact that her nose was actually in a state of healing, this fracture that was going on. And you can tell that when any forensic anthropologist in particular, and it's, they're involving UT in this, so that's going to be the people in the forensic anthropology department there. That they're able to understand the difference between fresh trauma, which is going to be associated with the immediate cause of death, and healing trauma. Well, if there's no other report of her having sustained a fractured nose and it was in the healing process, I think that my question probably would be, time-wise, given the state of healing, how long prior to this fatal event did this fractured nose, happen? I think that goes a long way to kind of establishing perhaps, what you're going to find relative to her, and kind of, and there's no way, we're decades now, downrange. As a matter of fact, I guess, in 2 years, this will have occurred 60 years ago.
Yeah.
There's no way that we can, actually go back, and there's no one to charge now. He's dead and gone. He's buried somewhere up there, maybe adjacent to her. I don't know. I've never visited the grave. Don't care to. But what I'm saying is there's nobody to charge here. But just perhaps, the mystery behind the assassins that chased them down that night has finally been solved. And it wasn't the Dixie Mafia. It wasn't some phantom that emerged in the night. According to what the TBI says now, if he were still alive today, they put the bracelets on him. They take him downtown. They would ask him questions because he would be the prime suspect. But Dave, you started something here, and I would be remiss for not following up with it, and I'm going to go ahead and say it now. If you or anybody is in a violent relationship, I'm pleading with you, you got to get them help. Now, I'm not saying I have all the answers. I'm not saying anybody else does either, but a place to start is going to be the National Domestic Violence Hotline. And let me give you that number. I'll repeat it after I say it the first time. It's 1-800-799-7233. That's 1-800-799-7233. I do hope that Pauline Pusser rest in peace, and I hope that her death stands for something more than the false image that was created by her husband, that it stands for what is a problem in this country, and that is domestic violence. Those are the memories that we should hold on to relative to the murder of Pauline Pusser. I'm Joseph Scott Morgan, and this is Body Bags.
This is an iHeart podcast. Guaranteed Human.